Hi, I'm Willie Mayoral. So I'm doing my review and analyze phase for my week 3 assignment A. So this was my teaching my lesson plan. So when I think of something that I learned from this is I think the main thing is as much planning as I do for a lesson, it doesn't always fall the same way I'd like to as on paper. So I need to be able to make changes. I noticed right away that some of my English language learners weren't grasping the same concepts as some of my native speakers to English. So I had to change some of the instruction. I also had to set up, differentiated instruction. I did different groups with different levels. Uh, if I could change anything, the topic that I touched on was really broad and then got really specific. I think this would have been the end of the week. I think I would have done a little bit more setup throughout the week when I'm looking at explaining tragedies, explaining narrative, and then getting to theme and specific themes with different things. Um, I really enjoyed the engagement of my students. Uh, for me, this is a lab course. So primarily, it's almost like independent study. I still do lessons, but they're broken up into chunks, smaller chunks, 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. Um, I think that my students and I both really enjoyed the engagement between both of us, where my students were asking questions, my students were giving responses, my students were connecting ties to their own lives, to things that they knew. I started talking about the basis of tragedy and heroes. One of my students brought up Denzel Washington in Man on Fire, which was a great reference because most of my students understood what we were talking about. They had all seen the movie and they all understood it. So I was able to relate characters from Shakespearean tragedies to this movie that we all saw, and I could tell them about progression, theme, plot, and it was just really great. My assessment, it was a little bit like I said, it was more of if I had a whole week to study it and to give it to my students, I would be able to give a more zoned in instruction and assessment. This was a little vague, so for my students, I had them write a paragraph telling me what it was they learned throughout the day and what it is they enjoyed about it. After, I just finished class probably about a half an hour ago. I just finished reading all my stuff. A lot of my students tended to get the general ideas of plot progression, theme. They understood tragedy and what tragedy meant, and they also understood what they can gain from tragedy. A lot of my students really like just the different setting of our class structure by being able to engage, being able to get input, and then receive back feedback from me. Like I said, I think one of the big things I learned about planning was that as much as I want to follow a structure on my plans, it doesn't always fall that way, especially with time. Some of my aspects, like my warm up, was pretty quick, and I was able to get through that relatively quickly, as opposed to my guided practice. I wanted to take a little bit more time so that they knew what it was, you know, I wanted them to give back to me. And I did take a little bit more time explaining my objectives of what I wanted out of them. Um, for implementation of my plan, I learned that on a structure, you really have to zone in on day to day stuff, where it's a little bit easier to create a generalized week plan, or let's say a plan for a standard where we can kind of space it out. But for me, I think the big part is focusing on the details and looking at what it is exactly I need to do each day to day, because I don't want to waste time. I had an hour and 5 minutes. The good thing is my class is 6 hours long, so I was able to run over about 15 minutes on my lesson, which for me is a benefit. But I know if I'm looking at a block schedule or something, I want to be able to have it zoned in so my students don't miss out on their instructional time. I want to be able to give them the bang for their buck. I learned that really quickly that I need to move along. I need to get the information out. And it's great to have a really detailed and in-depth lesson plan. So these were my reflections on it. I really enjoyed this assignment. I think it's one of those things that we sit back and say, as much as we can learn in the classroom, I think we learn equally from actually doing our profession and teaching. So it was a positive experience. My students loved it. I loved it, and I can't wait to do more of it.